So in this video, we're going to be looking at some really simple PHP pagination. Nothing advanced, just something to get you started if you're struggling to paginate records from your database. So let's take a really quick look at how this works. It's not very complicated, and then we'll move on to coding this up. So you can see on the page we've got 5 records. I happen to be outputting the ID of each record. That just helps us see if this is working. We'll do that along the process. You can take it out if you want. And in the query string, we've got the page that we're currently on, and then we've got a per page. This is limited to 50, so if we go anything over 50, we default to 5, so you can customize that how you want. We've also got the links down here that relate to each of the pages, and all we do is we just click on them and we cycle through the results until, for example, we get to the last page and we've only got 1 record. So we've got 56 records in total. So if you've got data to work with, go ahead and use that. If not, generate some fake records, maybe using a library like Faker, which is a great PHP library for just generating fake data. Make sure you have your database set up. We will roughly go through what the sort of database structure that we're working with, but otherwise this is pretty much it. So let's go ahead and start coding this up. So we're starting with absolutely 0 code. The only thing I have is my opening PHP tag. Let's first of all look in the database just to see what we're working with. So here I have got 56 rows of data. All we have in the structure is an ID, which you'd expect for a table like articles, and a title, which I've randomly generated this data. So that's all we're working with. The database name is Pagination, and the table that we have that data stored in is articles. So the first thing that we want to do is go ahead and connect to our database. So we're going to be using PDO for this. So we're going to create a new PDO instance, and we're using MySQL as the driver. We need to choose the database name, which is Pagination, as we've just seen, and we need to choose the host that we're connecting to. In my case, it's just the local server. And then we type in our username and password as the second and third argument, and that gives us our database connection. So the first thing we're going to focus on is the user input, or rather the input that's going to be in the URL. So remember, we saw things like page equals 1, page equals 2, page equals 1, and per page equals 5. So we've got all of that. We need to work out how we grab this. So the first thing is we're going to create a variable called page. This is going to be a ternary operation to determine what we need to set this variable to. That sounds more complicated than it is. All we're going to do here is do an isSet check to see if that is set in the get superglobal array, which is basically the query string of the URL. So if that is set, we assign a value to it, and that value is going to be the same thing here, but what we're going to do is we're going to cast this to an integer. The reason we do this is because we only expect there to be a number in there, and when we start putting this value into a database query, we want to make sure that it is just a number. Any letters typed in there will just be cast to a number, whether that makes sense or not. Now, otherwise, we want the value to be 1. So if we just go back and put an echo in front of this, and we just hit enter, we get 1 out because we've not entered anything in here. However, if we do something like page equals 2, we see that value. So we've now captured the actual page that we want to be on. So now let's take a look at our per page. So you can have a fixed per page, in which case you would just type something like 5 or 10 or 15, whatever you want. But in my case, I'm going to allow this to be set in the URL. So again, we need to check if this is available. So we're going to check, and we're going to call this per-page. And if that is set, we want to go ahead and set that as we did exactly before. Otherwise, we want to set this to a sensible number, so maybe something like 5. Now, what we also want to do is we want to include a limit to this. We don't want this to go over a certain amount. If you leave this as it is, a user could technically just change that in the URL and say, well, I want 1,000 per page. That's going to bring back 1,000 results on the page, and that might not be desirable. So what we're going to do is we're going to say here, and $_get per page is less than or equal to 50, and you can play around with this value depending on what you want it to be set. So now what's going to happen if we go ahead and echo this out and we add per page, let's say per page 5, we're getting 5 here. If we change that to 4, we get 4, etc. Now, if we change this to 50, that's fine. However, if we change this to something like 1,000, it defaults back to 5. You could even default it back to the maximum amount if you wanted to. It's entirely up to you. So we're now set up in terms of user input. What we now need to do? Well, we need to construct our query to pull the results in. This is really straightforward. So let's go ahead and add our query in here. We're going to assign this to a variable called articles. So we're going to use the database connection that we created up here. And we're just going to, we can either prepare a statement or we can just execute a raw query. It doesn't really matter because we're not passing any placeholders into here. I'm going to prepare it in this case just in case you need to add anything else into this, and then we can just execute it later and you can pass in whatever you need. So we're going to select the ID and the title. You can obviously choose which records you want, fields you want to select from, and we're going to select that from the articles table, and we're going to do a limit. So I'm going to say limit 0, 5. Now, you might have seen limit on its own before, but limit 0, 5 or 5, 10, whatever you want to do, basically means we want to start at this value. It's 0 indexed, which means that 0 will be the first record pulled back from here, and 5 is the limit. So this is our limit, and this is where we're starting from. These will need to be dynamic, so we'll calculate them a little bit later. So we're going to go ahead and execute this query. If you are inserting anything else into here, so for example, a where clause, you can go ahead and pass an array into here with placeholders. So for example, I'll give you a silly example where ID equals 5. You could say where ID equals ID, and then in here, you'd go ahead and just place in ID and give that a number. But we're not doing that because we don't have any where clause. We don't need to take that into account, but it's there just in case you do. So now let's go ahead and actually look at the data that we get back. So we're going to say articles, and we're going to pull that articles result, and we're going to fetch all records. And we want to fetch these as an associative array. So we're going to say PDO fetch ASOC or associative. So now let's do a quick var dump on articles, and we will see our articles. So this is our article list. Obviously, at the moment, we're only showing 5 records because what we've done is we've started from 0 and we're only showing 5. If we bump that up to 20, we would see more records come through. But again, this needs to be dynamic, and this is where our pagination is controlled from. So now that we've got our actual articles through, we want to go ahead and output them. But we're going to look at the sort of dynamic nature of this in a bit. So let's close a PHP tag here and let's create a basic document. You don't really need to create a doc type or anything if you're playing around with this. Just go ahead and output them as you wish. But otherwise, in the body of my document, I'm just going to go ahead and loop through these articles. I'm not checking if they exist. It's entirely up to you how you handle this. So I'm going to be using the PHP shorthand syntax for this, but if you're using a templating language, you can obviously go ahead and do this. So we're going to say for each articles as article, and we're going to end our for each down here, so end for each. And what we want to do here inside is maybe have some kind of container for an article. So we're going to have a div with a class of article, and then inside of here, just in a paragraph, this would probably be in a header or something like that, I want to echo out the article name. So I'm going to say echo article, and remember we brought this back as an associative array, so we use our brackets to access the fields. In this case, it's title. So now we will see the following. So we've got 5 output up there still. We'll get rid of that in a minute, but we've got the first 5 records here. So let's go ahead and remove this echo. And for the purposes of the video, I'm also going to echo out the article ID, so just so we can see the positioning of where we're at. So that gives us the following. So we know that we've got 1 to 5 here. When we do say page 1 and per page 5, we should see these. When we do page 2, we should see 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay, so let's go ahead and reset this back to page 1. And let's go ahead and up here, work out the positioning. So the positioning is basically the limit. So we're going to replace certain variables within this limit, within this query. So we need to work out the start position. In fact, let's go ahead and do the per page first, because that's really straightforward. All we need to do is do the per page in here. And we can already see that come into play. If we do per page 10, we get 10 records. If we do 20, we get 20 records. So that's already a little bit more dynamic. But let's set the start position. So start is going to be this thing here, where we want to start the record or start the rows from. So what we need to do is work out whether page is greater than 1. Now the reason we want to do this is because if page is 1, we want to start at 0. We don't want to start at a certain record. We don't want to include that in our calculations. So if the page is greater than 1, we want to do a little calculation in here, and that's page, so the current page that the user is trying to access, times per page minus per page. Otherwise, we want this to be 0. So if the page is less than 1, we want that to be 0, or if it is 1 rather. Otherwise, we want to do this small calculation here. Let's take a look at what we actually get back from that and why that's important. So when we have page 1, and regardless of per page, that doesn't matter in this case, we're only looking at the start value. Page 1, we always want this query to start from the limit of 0. So remember, it's 0 indexed. If we do page 2 now, we see we get 5. Now what that's done is it's taken the current page we're on, we've multiplied it by the per page, and then we've taken away the per page from that. There are obviously other ways you can calculate this, but for this case, we'll just try and be as explicit as possible. So now that we've got the start, we can go ahead and just put that in there. Now remember, this is cast to an integer, and this is cast to an integer, so therefore this is never really going to be anything that's going to cause you any harm in this statement. The same with the per page value up there. So these two are as safe as possible within this query. There's not going to be any malicious input get past this. So now, if we go back to page 1, we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. On page 2, we now get 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on. So page 3, etc., etc. If I bump that up to 10, and we go back to page 1, we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Same with that, 11 up to 20. So this is now calculating the position we need to start at, it's calculating the limit, and we're getting them results out. Now, the only thing we've not done is actually grabbed or calculated how many records there are, and therefore worked out how many pages we need to display. And then what we can do is output the pagination. So this isn't too complicated, but we do need to update our original query. There are different ways you can actually grab the count of the records, the amount of records in the table. But I'm going to be using SQL calc found rows. This requires 2 queries, so you might want to do something like a count on all fields if you want to. There's several different ways you can do this. But let's go ahead and do it this way. So SQL calc found rows. We don't have a comma here, we just have a space, and then these are the fields that we want to select. So this hasn't changed anything at all. It works in exactly the same way. But what we can now do is we can query again, and this needs to come straight after this query. We can't do anything in between. And we can work out the pages from this total. So let's say total equals db query. So we're making a second query. And this time we're going to select found rows. That's going to give us the total amount of rows. And then we'll call it total. So we're naming it total. So if we do a var dump on total here, in fact we'll do total, let's do just a normal fetch, and let's have a look at this. So here we've got an array, and we've got total here. So that's the total, and it gives us 56. We know that there are 56 records in this table. So now that we've got the total, well, we need to sort of make this a little bit tidier. So I'm going to say fetch, and then grab that key. So this, if I just echo it, gives us 56. So we've now got the total amount of records in the table, and we can work out how many pages there are. This is a really simple calculation. All it is it's total divided by the per page. Now, this isn't going to look quite right at the moment. If we go ahead and refresh, we see 5.6, which is really weird. So let's say we have, we've got 10 per page. We know that that's going to be 5 pages, but then plus a little bit more. So we actually need 6 pages, because if we go to the last page, which will be 5, it'll be 6, then we've got these sort of hanging over. So this actually needs to be 6 pages. So all we do is we say seal, which means ceiling. It's basically rounding up. And then we have 6. So we now know that we've got 6 pages of records. Obviously, if your data changes, so if you want to say 5 per page, we've now got 12. If you want to do 1 per page, we know that we've got 56 pages, because that's now going to show 1 per page. So now we've got our page count. Let's get rid of that echo. And down here, let's create a little pagination container. And in here, we're going to loop through the pages. Again, I'm not doing any checking here, so you'll always see a default page 1, but you can go ahead and update this as you need. So we're going to do a for loop here. We're going to set x to 1. This is going to be the current page of each loop, while x is less than or equal to the amount of pages. We increment x, and let's go ahead and end that for just there. And inside of here, I'm just going to create an anchor. We'll not do the href for now, but we will output the page number. So let's echo x, and that's it. So now we have the following. So we've got 56 pages. It's pretty long, but say we had 10 per page, we've got 6 pages. And let's go back to page 1. So what we now need to do is allow a user to click on this and actually display what they want to see. We also need to take into account the per page, because that needs to persist. We don't want to click on page 2 and that reset back to say 5 per page. So inside of here then, what we want to do is our question mark to start our query string, and we want to say page equals, and we want to echo that x value. So now, if we go here, when we click this, we go through all of the pages up to the last page. But again, like I said, we don't want to be resetting this value. So all we need to do here is say and per page equals. Now, where do we get this per page value from? Well, it's already dynamically updated here in this per page variable. So we can just echo per page, and that will keep us up to date. So let's go and hit enter just to refresh. Page 1 per page is 10. Click 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and we're at the last page, and that's it. And the good thing about this is that because if we sort of come out of range, say page 8, we're not actually showing anything. We're not showing any data. So you could show a message there or whatever. We're not erroring here because we're putting this directly into the query. If the query doesn't return any results, we just don't see any results. So the last thing I want to do is highlight which number is currently selected. So we're currently on page 1, so I expect that to be bold or have a different color behind it. So all we need to do is just after the href's ending value, we want to open and close PHP tag. And we're going to do an if statement in here. And all this if statement is going to do is going to check if the current page, which remember we stored up here, is equal to x. So we can use a triple equals here because these should both be integers. And if that's the case, then we can go ahead and just echo out a class maybe of selected, like so. So if we refresh and I just inspect this page, basically what we'll see here is down here under our pagination, page 1 is selected. When I hit page 2, that changes to selected here. So obviously we don't want this. We want a class of selected or something like that. So we can target it with CSS. So all I'm going to do here then is I'm basically going to create a class called selected under this pagination element, and we can apply some styles to it. So let's create a really quick style sheet to do that. So let's create a new style sheet called app.css or something like that. And let's go ahead and say pagination a.selected, and we'll say font weight bold or some kind of number depending on the font that you're using. And now what we can do is load this in. So it's in CSS called app.css. So now whenever that's selected, it's going to take into account which one is selected, and you can see that's gone slightly bold when we click it. So a couple of warnings about this. We are now done, but you can see we're doing a lot on this page to actually determine things like positioning and the amount of pages. This could be structured a lot better within your application. So bear in mind when you are following along with this, use it as a general guide of how you go ahead and implement very basic pagination. It's not a good idea to output it all on this page because it does get very, very messy. I'm obviously not using views, we're just using this as our view. So that's how we do very basic PHP pagination and how simple it actually is.